Welcome to Rome, April 14th, 205 BCE. Living on the top floor of a 5-story insula, a Roman apartment building was a far cry from the life you used to lead. Exchanging the peaceful, sun-kissed fields of your farm for the dark, single room you now call home was a major sacrifice. But after more than a decade of open warfare between the Romans and Hannibal's Carthaginian forces, of hard-sown and nurtured crops raised and trampled, of poor growing seasons and drought, of one commander or another demanding tribute, you and your husband had enough certainty and decided to try your fortune within the protection of the city's walls. Your husband managed to find work as a carpenter, which surprised you as much as it did him. After all, he didn't have much experience in such things, and an injury after a run-in with a particularly surly Carthaginian commander last year made it difficult for him to walk, much less work. But with so many Roman soldiers having been lost in the war that they were even conscripting slaves and prisoners to serve in the legion, they couldn't afford to be too picky, and they had to take what they could get. Besides, there was a temple to the great mother goddess to be built, and somebody had to do it. Meanwhile, you were fortunate enough to find work as a hairdresser for a senator's family. It wasn't much, but between the two of you, you managed. As of last year, a lot of the other farmers who'd had to leave their farms were able to return, so you and your husband had been considering doing the same. In fact, the Senate tried forcing you to go back, but after a few years here in the city, you're not sure you'd want to. After all, your farmhouse was burned to the ground during the war, so it's not like there was much to go back to. And besides, you're getting to the point where you can afford a better place. Maybe even one of the main floor apartments, the ones that have running water inside. And the recent years of war notwithstanding, life on the farm was boring and predictable. There's always something new here to discover, to explore. As you walk home through the meandering claustrophobia of Rome's cobblestone streets, the clashing of metal against metal and shrill screams carried through the air by thunderous pounding freezes you in place. Was this it? Was even the city itself no longer safe from the marauding Carthaginian forces? As you begin to consider where you could possibly go for safety at this point, you notice nobody else seems to be sharing your concern. There were no fires, no smoke, nobody fleeing one way or another. Those around you were either casually strolling toward the source of the sound or continuing on with their day. Terror giving way to curiosity, you move toward the cacophony and find the sounds to be not of violence, but ecstasy. A large black stone sits atop a 4-horse chariot, along with a wealthy-looking woman and a Roman soldier, probably a general or somebody else important. A group of senators and soldiers walk alongside it, along with a group of wildly dressed people, dancing and screaming and gyrating and smacking their tambourines and clashing their cymbals together, and making sounds that you didn't even realize could come out of the human body. These women, you think they're women, are dressed in yellow, with tiaras upon their bleached hair, golden bracelets around their wrists, and heavily made-up faces not unlike the prostitutes you'd come to recognize in the city streets. You stop to ask another onlooker what's going on, and she tells you these are the Gallae, the priestesses of the great mother goddess, represented by the black stone on the chariot. They were to escort the goddess to her new home, the Temple of Victory, until her own temple was finished. With the Great Mother's help, Rome would defeat the Carthaginians and once more enjoy peace. This sort of thing never happened on the farm. This isn't the first time we visited Rome in this series, and there's a good reason for that. We don't get a view of any civilization, before or after, that's as detailed as we get from the Romans until the time the printing press is invented, at least in the Western historical tradition. Besides, I just think they're neat. In particular, we know quite a bit about Roman religious life. Before the rise of Christianity, the official Roman state religion involved the worship of Jupiter, Neptune, Saturn, Mars, Venus, and a whole bunch of other gods that didn't have planets named after them. But unlike Christianity, the Roman state religion was much more open to adopting the practices of other religions, so long as they didn't conflict with the Roman state religion. After all, it's a lot easier to conquer somebody when you tell them you haven't murdered their gods. They're just part of the club now. Christianity and Judaism were, of course, notable exceptions because they couldn't coexist with the Roman state religion. Christians not being able to coexist with other people from other religions, what a strange and unusual concept. That's completely not relatable in the modern day. I'm so glad we've moved past that, aren't you? When Rome conquered Greece, for example, the stories about their gods were adopted into the Roman pantheon to the point where they essentially became interchangeable. The stories of Zeus became the stories of Jupiter, the stories of Venus became the stories of Aphrodite, and so on. The Greek god Apollo had no Roman equivalent, but he ended up becoming such an important figure within Roman state religion that Augustus spent a decent amount of time basically doing an Apollo cosplay. The same goes for a lot of Eastern gods as well. The Zoroastrian god Mithras and the Egyptian gods Isis and Osiris are great examples of this. Not originally Roman, but once the Romans conquered the territory from which those gods came, they became part of the Roman state religion as well. And then there's Kybele. In case this is your first time joining us, welcome. My name is Sophie, and this is We Have Always Existed. It's a series where we explore the various transgender histories that can be found within the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. Kybele was a goddess from Phrygia in Anatolia, which is where we find most of modern-day Turkey. There's some interesting transgender stuff to be found in her mythology, and we're going to take a look at that first, but the real spicy stuff is going to come when we start exploring the Gallae, the priestesses of her worship. Because look, the Scythian Inari priestesses are really interesting, but we don't have any Scythian sources, so it's kind of hard to get a real solid idea of what they were about. And as I mentioned with the Elagabalus story, most of the sources we have, in fact, all of the sources we have, are extremely unreliable. But the Gallae are one of the most well-documented examples of transgender people living in the ancient Mediterranean. So I'm really excited about this one. It's going to take a little while to get to the Gallae though, because Kybele herself is pretty interesting, and I want to make sure her mythology gets its due as well. In fact, there's a lot I ended up having to cut out of this video, including some Kybele myths and how later Christians would use the Gallae as a propaganda tool to attack Roman paganism. And this thing is still going to be one of the longest videos I've ever made. I really should just give up on the idea of brevity altogether. It's clearly just not a thing that I'm gonna do. First, we'll talk about Phrygia, the area in Anatolia where the Kybele myth comes from. From there, we're going to explore some of the mythology around Kybele and her various associated figures, and how her worship ended up in Rome in the first place. From there, we'll spend some time with the Gallae, and we'll get an understanding of what daily life was like for them, how their fellow Romans treated them, some interesting Roman case law surrounding them, and a whole lot more. Special thanks go out to everybody who supports me on Patreon. I know we gotta do this thing. Everyone's gotta do it. It's part of the game, but it makes a big difference to me. If you're able to, and if you're willing, and if you got the spare scratch, it starts at just $1 a month, and it really does make a difference in helping me maintain this series. We live on planet piss. Capitalism sucks, but your support on Patreon makes my little corner of this planet a little less rank, so much appreciated, if you can. If you can't though, that's okay. Consider it like a tip jar for the performer. It's not necessary, it's not required, but it is appreciated. But if you can't, you can still do me a little favor. In the ancient world, we worshipped gods. In the modern world, we worship algorithms. So if you like what I do here, if you think other people might be interested in what I do here, do me a favor, pause the video and just scroll down a little bit, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and drop me a comment below if you could. Even if it just says something like, "I like your video, Sophie," that makes a big difference. All the different YouTube bloops and blips, all that stuff helps me to get seen by people like you. So if somebody like you likes this video, then somebody like you should like the video. And that way other people like you are more likely to see the video. So like, comment, subscribe. All the cool kids are doing it. And without further ado, let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Origins of Kybele. Kybele comes from Phrygia, So let's take a moment to understand a little bit about Phrygia before we get into her myths. It's not one of the more mainstream ancient cultures, you probably haven't heard of them, but much like the music of a band like Lilliput might not be on your radar, they ended up having a deep influence on the music of Kurt Cobain, which of course had a heavy influence on everything that came after. So in a way, this obscure little Swedish band made an impact that far outlasted their brief existence. And similarly, the Phrygian culture made a huge impact on the Romans, which of course would influence everything that came afterwards, including us. Oh, it says here I'm supposed to put in a joke about how much white trans women love Kurt Cobain here. Phrygia was a kingdom in central Anatolia, becoming the dominant power in the area around 1200 to 700 BCE, with its capital at Gordium. They were a landlocked kingdom surrounded on all sides by various powers, at times hostile and at times friendly. According to the Iliad, the Phrygians fought on the Trojan side of the war, opposing the Greeks. Phrygia hit its peak under King Midas, who ruled during the late 700s BCE. Now, you might recognize that name, King Midas. You know, the everything he touches turns to gold guy? It's a different King Midas. That King Midas, the mythological one, is a Phrygian king, but this King Midas that we're talking about is not the same guy. They're two, I know it's confusing. They're two different guys. This King Midas is actually a descendant of the original mythological guy that we just talked about, and he's considered Phrygia's greatest king, but Phrygia would fall under him as well after being invaded around the year 695 BCE by a culture called the Cimmerians, whom we're told had a lot in common with the Scythians, to the point where some sources actually mistake the two, but scholars do think they're two distinct cultures. Their neighbors, the Lydians to the west, eventually expelled the Cimmerians, but instead of giving the Phrygians their freedom, they just decided, well, you're part of our club now, and they became part of Lydia. When Lydia fell to the Persians under Cyrus the Great in 546 BCE, Phrygia went with them, and they became part of the Persian Empire. And there they stayed until the time of Alexander the Great. In 333 BCE, during his conquest of the Persian Empire, he showed up in Gordium. If you've ever heard the story of cutting the Gordian knot, this is where it happened and when it happened. When Alexander's empire fell apart after his death, Phrygia became part of the kingdom of Pergamum, which became a part of the Roman Empire during the 1st century BCE, and then the Byzantine Empire, once the East and West Roman Empires split in the 4th century CE, and then the Ottoman Empire in the 13th century CE, and today it's part of Turkey. Phrygian religion was polytheistic, but the only deity we know for sure that the Phrygians worshipped is Kybele. We don't really know much about how the Phrygians worshipped her. We can make some educated guesses based on how the Romans and the Greeks worshipped her, but we don't know much about Phrygian religious life when it comes to Kybele. So how did her worship travel? It may seem surprising in the modern world, but in the ancient world, the west coast of Anatolia was thoroughly Greek for the vast majority of its existence. The Greek areas were conquered by various powers at various points, but they still maintained their Greek identity. Herodotus and Hesiod, for example, two very important Greek writers, were both from this region. So it's thought that when Kybele was worshipped by the Phrygians, her worship spread to the Lydians, which from there spread to the Greeks along the west coast of Anatolia, which from there spread to the Greek mainland, and, well, you know the rest. The earliest inscriptions we have about Kybele come from, of course, Phrygia, where she's described as Mater Kubileia, or Mother of the Mountains. The mountains they're referring to are the mountains in Anatolia, one of which is called Mount Ida. Now, Kybele's association with Mount Ida has some interesting mythological connotations, so let's take a look. Mount Ida is in Anatolia, just south of where the city of Troy was. If you're familiar with the story of the Iliad, you know about the Trojan horse. The Greeks assembled the Trojan horse, crammed themselves into it, showed up to the Trojan gates and said, hey, we're done fighting, here's a gift, we'll see you later, goodbye. The Trojans brought it into the city. Of course, the Greeks were hiding inside. The Trojans partied, they got drunk, they celebrated, and when they all passed out, the Greeks jumped out of the horse and murdered them all. During the chaos, the Trojan hero Aeneas gathered a group of survivors who ended up fleeing the city and heading south to Mount Ida. While they were there, they built a fleet to escape and find a new home. They made their way to Italy from there, where they ended up laying the foundations for what would become the Roman people. This little tidbit is interesting, so keep it in mind. Mount Ida was also the place from which Zeus abducted the beautiful young boy Ganymede to serve as his gay lover. I mean cupbearer, just cupbearer, not gay lover. There was nothing gay about it. There was nothing weird about it. Zeus has totally normal sexual appetites. He's not into any weird shit. He's only into heterosexual normal sex, like the time where he turned into a swan and Leto, or the time where he turned into a bull and Europa, or the time where he turned into a golden shower and fucked Danae, or the time he turned into a cloud and had sex with Io, or they were all of them deceived, for a second Mount Ida was created. The second Mount Ida is on the island of Crete, southwest of the one that we just talked about. Before Zeus and his siblings were in charge, their father Kronos was the ruler of the universe. Kronos violently overthrew his father Uranos, who warned him that the same thing was going to happen to him. So every time he got his wife pregnant, who goes by many different names, Rhea, Gaia, and Kybele, he would devour the baby as soon as it was born. After all, it's hard to overthrow somebody when you're being digested by them. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, every single one of them down the hatch, one after another. Baby number 6 comes along, and Kybele's getting tired of this sort of thing. So she pretends to have a baby, but instead of giving the baby to Kronos, she gave a big boulder the size of a baby. And I guess he didn't look too closely because he just sent it down the hatch too. Then Kybele went off to have her baby on her own. And that baby's name? Albert Einstein. No, it was Zeus. Kybele hid Zeus in a cave in the Cretan Mount Ida and had her devotees hang around, clashing cymbals together, shaking tambourines, pounding on drums, making loud shrieks and cries, to make sure that Kronos, of course, couldn't hear baby Zeus crying. All this sound familiar? Zeus, of course, would grow up, overthrow his father, make his father barf up all of his siblings as well as that rock. Apparently that's an important rock for some reason, and then banish Daddy to a corner of the underworld. The Cretan Mount Ida is pretty much smack dab in the middle of the island, southwest of the Knossos Palace, if you're familiar with Aegean prehistory and the Minoans. If you're not, it's okay, don't worry about it. If you watched my video on Hermaphroditus, you might remember that Mount Ida is also where Ovid said Hermaphroditus was born. The Mount Ida that he's talking about is the one that's near Troy. Later Greeks and Romans would see Kybele as a mother goddess as well. The Greeks associated her with their mother goddess Gaia, who's also associated with Rhea, and the Romans called her Magna Mater, or Great Mother. Kybele has a bunch of other names as well, and I might mention them as they come up, but for the most part I'm just going to keep calling her Kybele, because I don't want things to get too confusing. There's enough weirdness around mythology as it is without referring to someone by like 5 different names over and over. So Kybele is the name I'm going to refer to her as going forward. But here's the tricky part. When we think of a mother goddess, our views are necessarily colored by a post-Christian idea of what a mother goddess and a mother figure in mythology should look like. If you're like me, you grew up as a Christian. And if you didn't, you probably still grew up in a part of the world where Christianity was the dominant religion. And even if you didn't, it's a good bet that the Abrahamic tradition was still somewhat of an influence over your life. So the closest figure we have to a mother goddess in Christianity is, of course, the Virgin Mary. And all she really did was give birth to Jesus. She shows up in a couple of points here and there afterwards, but for the most part, the important element of her story begins and ends with the birth of Christ. Now, as we mentioned, Kybele does give birth to Zeus, but she does a lot more than just that. Chapter 2. Kybele and Attis. Some of the most important myths we have about Kybele relate to her and Attis. Attis is described as her youthful consort, which is somewhere between like the 1960s Robin was to Batman and a fuckboy. Attis is a deity with Phrygian origins, but it's unlikely that he was a Phrygian deity. Wait, what? From what we can tell, Attis seems like it was a really common name for Phrygian men, and especially for Phrygian priests. So what most scholars think happened was that they just took the name Attis and turned it into a god because it was a common name for the area, and they heard a lot of priests named Attis, so, oh, it must be a holy figure. I guess they just kind of rolled with it. For those of us who grew up in a part of the world where Christianity was the dominant religion, it's easy to get wrapped up in ideas about canon. You know, what did happen, what didn't happen as far as myth goes. And a lot of Christian nerds have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the canon is, what did and didn't happen in the Bible, because it contradicts itself all the time. It reminds me of how Star Trek nerds behave. Why was the Voyager crew able to travel back to the year 1996 and see no evidence of the widespread destruction caused by Khan Noonien Singh as a result of the eugenics wars? Why did they assume type androids like Data and Lore were the only artificial life forms to exist in the galaxy, despite Harry Mudd having been shown with several androids nearly a century prior? Why does it say in Genesis 32:20, quote, "I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved"? But in John 1:18 it says, "No man has seen God at any time." The ancients, of course, wouldn't have cared about any of this. Not until the Council of Nicaea, when Christian dogma was properly defined, and not until Star Trek: The Next Generation came out in 1987, and the Trek timeline started to get a little muddier. That's why so many early Christian writings are so weird compared to what actually ended up in the Bible. You think Revelation is wild? A 2nd century Christian Roman writer named Tertullian claimed that Jesus was a eunuch. Maybe I'll do a video on that sometime. Who knows? Anyway, with ancient myth, the stories often directly contradict each other, and nobody really seemed to care about it. We talked about this in the Hermaphroditus video, and it's a thing with Kybele as well. And it's gonna be the same with any other deity that we look at throughout this series. We have a few different surviving sources when it comes to the myths of Attis, but there's two we're gonna look at in particular today, from Pausanias and from Ovid. We've talked about Ovid before. He gave us useful information on the Scythians, he gave us useful information on Hermaphroditus, and here he is again. He's a Roman writer from the end of the 1st century BCE and the beginning of the 1st century CE. His most famous book is the Metamorphoses, where he catalogs all the different transformations in Roman mythology, including a bunch of gender ones, which is why he keeps coming up. I'm sure this isn't the last time we're going to visit him in this series. Ovid tells us about Attis in the Metamorphoses. The TLDR version is that Attis was a beautiful young shepherd boy whom Kybele fell in love with. She made Attis her priest on the condition that he preserve his chastity, which of course he didn't. So she made him go mad and he castrated himself, because I guess that's just a thing that you do. After that, Kybele felt sorry for him, so she turned him into a fir tree and declared that any other devotees of hers would be castrated as well. Now let's look at Pausanias. He was a Greek living in the Roman Empire during the 2nd century CE, and he tells us another myth about Attis related to identities. The story goes that, well, Zeus had a wet dream. Pausanias says he fell asleep and dripped some seed onto the earth, but what else could that have been? Zeus had a wet dream. Anyway, from his little nocturnal emission sprang up Identities. Identities was more or less humanoid, but had both sets of sex organs and was also wild and chaotic. This was frightening to a lot of the gods, so Dionysus took it upon himself to solve the issue. He did so by tying her dick to her foot while she was sleeping. And then when she woke up, she ended up flailing about, and she flailed so hard that she tore off her own dick. And they tossed it on the ground, and from there an almond tree sprouted. So I guess if I want my garden to grow better, I just need to... Anyway, a local girl picked some almonds from the tree and put them down her shirt, because I guess that's where you store almonds. I don't know, I was never told that, but I don't eat a lot of almonds anyway, but okay, next time I eat almonds, I know, put them down my shirt. The almonds absorbed into her chest and got her pregnant, and from there, she had a baby. And that baby was Attis. She abandoned Attis to be raised by goats. The goats did a fine job of raising him, and he grew up to be a perfectly well-adjusted man. Thank you very much. I don't know why anybody finds that weird. He ended up being betrothed to the daughter of the king of Pessinus, but the problem was that Identities had fallen in love with him. So at their wedding, Identities showed up and made Attis go crazy, and again he castrated himself. Identities apologized, and Zeus made Attis immortal as a, sorry about your dick, bud, but at least you get to live forever. You might notice that Kybele is not mentioned by name in this story, but a lot of other ancient sources tell us that Identities is one of Kybele's names. So, hey, Kybele was intersex kinda. That's kinda cool. There's a few other Attis stories we have as well, including some from the Roman poet Catullus and from the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate's writings. But most of them have a few consistent threads. Attis is born, Kybele falls in love with him, she makes him go crazy, he castrates himself, and she's sad about it, and also there's usually a tree involved. So, what's with all the dick chopping? Well, it's complicated. In the Pausanias story, when Aegisthus tears her own, the resulting wound drenches the earth with godlike blood, and from there sprouts a whole bunch of different nature stuff. And I guess it's a roundabout way of getting there, but a mother goddess also being a fertility figure, I guess it kind of makes sense. On the other hand, Ovid tells us that Attis's castration is a result of a punishment because he was disloyal to Kybele. And considering how highly the Romans looked at Kybele, I guess it makes sense, but it's still driven by madness, and that's the consistent thread here. This is going to show up again in how the Romans viewed worship of Kybele later on, so keep this one in mind. Anyway, if you're a little confused by all of this, you're not alone. The Romans were too, but that didn't stop them from greatly revering Kybele. Chapter 3. Roman worship of Kybele. It was only a matter of time before we started talking about Virgil in this series. Publius Vergilius Maro is his full name, and he was one of the three great poets of the Augustan age, along with Horace, the Carpe Diem guy. You've probably heard that phrase before. That's from the poet Horace, and our boy Ovid. He wrote just 3 poems, the Eclogues, the Georgics, and the Aeneid, the latter of which he wasn't finished writing when he died. He asked for it to be destroyed on his deathbed because he wasn't happy with it, but Augustus thought it was way too important, so he denied the man's wishes and published it anyway. Maybe not the best outcome when it comes to respecting an artist's wishes, but man's been dead for like 2,000 years. I'm not going to get too bent out of shape over it. The Aeneid. Is this going to show up backwards on the camera? Well, let's find out. Hopefully you don't have to read it as Anyway, this book is a sort of sequel to the Iliad. It takes place around the same time as the Odyssey and tells the tale of the Trojan hero Aeneas, who escaped the destruction of Troy with a handful of Trojan survivors, making their way around the Mediterranean and eventually arriving in Italy, where they lay the foundations for what would become the city of Rome. We might look at it today as state propaganda, but the only reason we do is because it absolutely is. It was commissioned by the Emperor Augustus, and that's really clear when you read it because it kisses his ass in pretty much every chance it can, but it's also a masterful work of Latin poetry. So if Virgil tells us how important the cult of Kybele was to the Romans, I'm going to take his word for it, and he certainly does. Quote, "What god, you muses, warded off such savage flames from the Trojans? Who drove from the ships such raging fire? Tell me, trust in the tale is old, yet its fame will never die. In the early days on Phrygian Ida's slopes, when Aeneas first built his fleet, gearing up for the high seas, they say the Berecynthian mother of gods," he's talking about Kybele, "herself appealed to powerful Jove with pleading words. 'Grant this prayer, my son, that your loving mother makes to you, since now you rule on Olympus's heights.'" Virgil is referring to when Aeneas, after fleeing Troy, got to Mount Ida and built his ships to escape the destruction, which happens earlier in Book 3. As he was doing so, Kybele watched over him. So right away we see that without Kybele's help, mythologically speaking, Aeneas would never have escaped Troy, and therefore Rome would never have existed. So as far as the Romans were concerned, they owed everything they had to Kybele. On top of that, she's also the mother of Jupiter, who's their king of the gods, and that's kind of a big deal too, it turns out. In Book 10, Aeneas is sailing back to Italy to the Trojan camp that's currently under siege by the Latins. Kybele sends some water nymphs to help speed them along the way. These water nymphs were actually Trojan ships that had sank earlier in the book, whom Kybele turned into water nymphs to help them out. Had they not reached the Trojan camp in time, of course it would have been destroyed. So again, no Rome. So that's too the Romans owe Kybele. Okay, one more example. This one comes from the Roman historian Titus Livius, or just Livy. He was a contemporary of Virgil and Ovid, but instead of poetry, he wrote a book of history. In fact, he did an enormous work of history in 142 books, but Unfortunately, only 35 of them survive today. Toward the end of the 3rd century BCE, Rome was in the middle of a long and costly war with Carthage, which we call the Second Punic War. The Carthaginian general Hannibal was rampaging throughout Italy, wiping out Roman armies much bigger than his, and conquering a significant chunk of Roman territory. This was the last time anybody had any real chance of halting the spread of Roman hegemony throughout the Mediterranean, and they came pretty close to doing it. Hannibal paused his campaign in the winter of 205 BCE. This gave the Romans a chance to catch their breath and plan their next move. Having recently won a couple of key victories over the Carthaginians, they had kind of a renewed sense of purpose and confidence. So this was actually a pretty optimistic time for the Romans. So they consulted the Sibylline books. Nothing to do with Kybele. I know it sounds similar, but it's not the same thing. This book was a collection of oracles supposedly acquired by the final king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, sometime in the late 500s BCE. The Romans would turn to these books for guidance during important moments in their history, and, well, this was about as important a moment as they had faced in the last couple hundred years. In the book, they found that if a foreign invader was ever making war in Italy, they could be repelled if the Romans brought the great mother of Mount Ida, that is, Kybele, to Rome. They went to Pessinus. Remember we said that Attis was betrothed to the daughter of the king of Pessinus? Same place. It's in what used to be Phrygia, but of course during the Roman times, it was just the kingdom of Pessinus. They went there and negotiated to bring back the black meteorite, which was an important symbol of the goddess, back to Rome. The king of Pessinus was an ally of Rome, so it wasn't a terribly difficult negotiation. They built a temple to house the thing on the Palatine Hill, a central location within Rome which was considered a great honor. And just a few years later, the Romans declared victory over Carthage. So that's 4 they owe the goddess. Chapter 4. Finally, we're getting to the trans stuff. Okay, so you get the point. Kybele was very important to the Romans. And I know there hasn't been a whole lot of trans stuff so far, and you're probably wondering where that's coming in because it's kind of my thing. And I mean, you heard the chapter title. Obviously, it's here now, but I wanted you to get a good understanding of what Kybele meant to the Romans. So when I tell you how terribly the Romans treated her followers, the Gallae, you have some better context for it. As I mentioned before, her followers were called the Gallae. Gallae is plural, Galla is singular. You might also have seen it referred to as Gallus, Galli, which is the masculine version. Without getting too deep into a Latin linguistics lesson here, words that end with US are masculine and words that end with a are feminine most of the time. And the Gallae are referred to as both in ancient literature. So I'm going to lean more toward the feminine one for reasons that I think are going to become pretty clear as we go forward. Anyway, when the black stone that represented Kybele arrived in Rome in the late 3rd century BCE, her Gallae came with them. And though the Romans loved and venerated Kybele, they really weren't a big fan of the Gallae. Why? First of all, they were eunuchs, and the Romans had a complicated relationship with eunuchs. On one hand, if you were wealthy enough, you might seek out eunuch slaves in particular. They were highly desirable because they were more obedient and they were less likely to fuck your wife. But the Romans also felt pretty squeamish about the whole process in the first place. The Emperor Vespasian supposedly made his wealth buying and selling eunuch slaves, but about 50 years later, the Emperor Hadrian found the process so icky that he banned it from the empire altogether, going so far as to execute anybody who did it, as well as anybody who volunteered to have it done with them. So the Romans liked their slaves to be eunuchs, but they didn't like to think about the whole process that made a eunuch into a eunuch in the first place. It's kind of like how we are today in the West with fast fashion. We want cute clothes, quick and cheap, but we don't want to think about all the human rights violations and all the environmental destruction wrought by getting so much stuff so quickly. This video is sponsored by Shein. Enter the code SOPHIEISSAD for a 10% savings on your moral crisis with your order. The 1st century BCE Roman writer Lucretius writes about how disturbed he was by the process of the Gallae castrating themselves. Quote, "They give her eunuchs as attendant priests to signify that those who have defied their mother's will and shown ingratitude to their father must be counted unworthy to bring forth living children into the sunlit world." It's worth noting that we might consider Lucretius today to be a hardline atheist, so it's hard to tell whether he's disturbed by the fact that they're eunuching themselves or the fact that they're doing it because they have a religious reason for doing it. Speaking of which, the actual eunuching itself happens on the Dies Sanguinis, or the Day of Blood. On March 24th of each year, initiate Gallae would dance wildly to the entrancing rhythms of drums, tambourines, and crashing cymbals, whip themselves into a frenzy, and finally, using a sharp stone, a broken piece of pottery, or a knife, snip snip. Then they would rampage through the city, waving their newly removed bits around in the air before tossing them into a nearby house. And I'm trying to imagine how I might react if I was just sitting there cooking a stew for the day, and all of a sudden, some dismembered dick just flies through the window. Hey honey, it's the Day of Blood, better close the shutters. Yep, this is definitely going on the list. After all this, they would have a feast, and then they would rest for a day, which is probably pretty important considering the amount of blood they would have lost, and forever discard any male clothing they still had, and live like ladies. Now, we're all familiar with togas, which men wore, but Roman women would wear a garment called a stola. It was considered bad form for women to wear a toga because it was associated with prostitution and adultery. So the next time the local college kids throw a toga party, you should definitely go over there and tell all the women that they're dressed like prostitutes. This will definitely go over really, really well, and you'll definitely be the coolest, most interesting person at the party, and you'll make a lot of friends. Trust me. Anyway, the Gallae would wear stolae, usually yellow or multicolored. They would grow their hair long, bleach it blonde, and wear it in a style common to women of the day. They would also wear tons of jewelry, including earrings, pendants, rings, and they would also wear heavy makeup. On the top of their head, they'd often wear a turban or a tiara, sometimes both. Take a look at this sculpture of a Gallae, for example. It's from the 2nd century CE in the Capitoline Museum in Rome. I know it's kind of hard to tell, but she's dressed like a lady. St. Augustine talks about this in more detail as well, saying, quote, "These effeminates, not later than yesterday, were going through the streets and places of Carthage with anointed hair, whitened faces, relaxed bodies, and feminine gait." The whitened faces part refers to the makeup that they wore. A lot of Roman cosmetics at the time were designed to lighten one's skin because it was considered a sign of beauty and class. After all, if you had lightened skin, it's because you could afford to get slaves to do all the work for you while you just stayed at home and relaxed. So, the Gallae having whitened faces was likely related. To the rest of the Romans, this was confusing, to say the least. They couldn't take on a man's role anymore because of the snippy snip, but they also couldn't bear children, so they couldn't take on a woman's role. So they lived in this kind of liminal space between genders, and I'm sure at least a few of my viewers can relate to that. I know I can. They also apparently had some wild parties, as Lucretius describes, quote, "A thunder of drums attends the Great Mother, tight stretched and pounded by palms, and a clash of hollow cymbals. Hoarse-throated horns bray their deep warning, and the pierced flute thrills every heart with Phrygian strains." Ovid describes a similar scene in his Fasti, quote, "The eunuchs will parade and pound the hollow drums, and their clashing bronze cymbals will ring. She will ride on the soft necks of her acolytes, howled along the city's major streets. The stage roars, the shows call. I have much to ask, but the strident cymbals clash, and the claw pipe's chilling noise scare me." This isn't the only time there's reference to their necks being soft. Firmicus Maternus says, quote, "They can barely hold their heads up on their limp necks." It seems like having limp necks is a sign of effeminacy, kind of like a limp wrist is today. Is he, you know? The worship of Kybele was always associated with wild parties. They're mentioned as far back as the Homeric hymns, which is a collection of hymns that the ancients attributed to Homer. But they were almost certainly not written by Homer, but we don't know who wrote them, so we just keep calling the Homeric hymns. They probably come from around the 7th century BCE. Homeric hymn number 14 is to Kybele, and it reads, quote,
Prithee, clear-voiced muse, daughter of mighty Zeus, sing of the mother of all gods and men. She is well pleased with the sound of rattles and timbrels, with the voice of flutes and the outcry of wolves and bright-eyed lions, with echoing hills and wooded combes. And so hail to you in my song, and to all goddesses as well.
That's not an excerpt, that's the whole thing. Okay, so Kybele loved a lot of loud noise. Why? Remember the story about how the devotees of Kybele made a whole bunch of loud noise to drown out the cries of baby Zeus as he was hiding on Mount Ida? We assume it has something to do with that. Anyway, the Romans weren't big fans of all this. The average Roman man was shocked by their dress and their behavior, but they were even more shocked by the entire ritual around the dies sanguinis. After all, what sort of man would voluntarily make himself a eunuch? What sort of man, indeed? But this put them in a conundrum. As disgusted as they were by the Gallae, they were also deeply devoted to the worship of Kybele. Prosecuting, exiling, or otherwise mistreating the Gallae would risk offending the goddess, and they didn't want that, not after all she'd done for them. So the Romans did the only humane thing. They locked the Gallae up like animals and fed them a bucket of fish heads once a week. It saved the empire. The Senate declared that the Gallae would be confined to the temple of Kybele that they'd built, except for on festival days. They also forbade any Roman citizen from joining their ranks. But that was complicated because at the time, Roman citizenship didn't include a whole lot of people. When they brought the Kybele stone to Rome, the Roman state included Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, and the parts of Italy that weren't currently under Hannibal's control. But that didn't automatically make you a citizen. There were really only two ways to get Roman citizenship. One, be born into it, or two, earn it, usually through military service. It wasn't until the Emperor Caracalla, remember him? Elagabalus claimed to be his child, and that's what led to her becoming the emperor, that everybody who lived in the empire was granted citizenship. But he did that in the year 212 CE, which is like 400 years later than what we're talking about here. Livy tells us that the population of Roman citizens in the year 209 BCE, which is the closest we've got to the time that we're looking at, was 137,108. But it's hard to know how many people in total there were, including slaves and non-citizens. The question of Rome's population at any given time is always a complicated question, and I'm not going to get too much into it because it's not the purpose of this video, but suffice it to say, there were plenty of non-citizens living in the Roman state at the time that could have served as Gallae. But even though they had a pretty good supply of new recruits locally, they still got most of their Gallae from the east. But beyond not being allowed to be Gallae themselves, Roman citizens weren't even allowed to enter the parts of the temple where the Gallae lived. It seemed like the Senate wanted them entirely removed from Roman day-to-day life, except for the festivals that they were a part of. This raises an interesting point, though, because the Romans would not have made laws banning citizens from becoming Gallae unless there were citizens who wanted to become Gallae. Because why would you make a law banning people from doing something that nobody wanted to do in the first place? Think of it this way. If you're an elder millennial like me, you might remember the salvia craze that was big in the early 2000s. Remember everyone started talking about salvia and everyone started smoking salvia, and then everybody tried it and realized that it sucked and nobody bothers with it anymore? And as a result, most jurisdictions don't have any laws against it. The government still doesn't want you getting high, but there's no point making laws banning something that nobody wants to do in the first place. So if the Romans created laws banning citizens from becoming Gallae, it must have been because some citizens wanted to become Gallae. And why would some citizens want to become Gallae? I'm so glad you asked. Chapter 5. No, really, why? I wish we knew more about the daily lives of the Gallae. What did they do all day when they were locked in the temple? And I'm sure there are at least a few polyamorous trans lesbians in the audience today who are wondering what they might have been doing. And yes, it's fun to imagine that, but we really have no evidence for it one way or another. That doesn't mean we can't muse about it, though. The Romans were a little confused by all of this as well, but fortunately, we have both Lucian and our constant companion Ovid to help illuminate the subject for us. It's easy to say that they just followed Attis's original example, and that's basically what Ovid tells us. But Ovid's writing, as fascinating as it is, comes from the 1st century CE. And from what we can tell, worship of Kybele had been around for at least a few hundred years before that. So it's a good bet that Ovid didn't actually know where the Gallae came from, and his explanation is just as likely a post hoc rationalization than it is an actual understanding of their origins. Besides, there's more to it than that. Lucian was a Greek writer who lived in Roman-ruled Syria during the 2nd century CE. He provides 2 possible explanations in his work on the Syrian goddess, but there's one he says that's more compelling. So we're going to take a look at that one. And I have to stress right off the bat that he says this is the more compelling of the 2 stories. In this story, the Syrian queen Stratonike received a vision in a dream that she was to build a great temple. So she left to do so, and the king sent his best friend Kybele along to accompany her. He decided to castrate himself as a precaution, which is a totally normal and rational thing to do, and left his bits in a jar at home. Stratonike fell in love with him while they were on their voyage, but he let her know about his status and rejected her. The king had guards follow the 2, and when they saw Stratonike's advances, they confused it for Kybele trying to get fresh with her. So they told the king, and he planned on executing Kybele, but Kybele asked for his bits in the jar, at which point the king realized his mistake and conferred great gifts upon his friend. And I swear this is the story that Lucian tells, and not just some bizarre fever dream that I had after smoking too much salvia. So how does this connect with the Gallae? The king built a bronze statue of Kybele, and all of his friends castrated themselves as well out of sympathy for him. Then later, another woman fell in love with Kybele, but when she found out about his status, she was so distraught that she killed herself, and so Kybele dressed like a woman for the rest of his life to prevent that sort of thing from happening ever again. His friends did too, and eventually they became the Gallae. This might be the most elaborate still cis though story I've ever heard in my life. So yeah, Kybele says this is the more believable of the 2 stories, and yeah, I know. But it does actually have some parallels with some stories that come out of Persia and India, notably in connection with the foundation myth of the Hijra, who have ancient roots and are still around today. That said, it's still obviously very much exaggerated. But okay, so Lucian aside, what about Ovid? What does Ovid tell us? The last poem he completed before his death, in the year 17 or 18 CE, we're not sure which, was the Fasti, a sort of catalog of Roman religious festivals. And we don't think he actually completed everything he wanted to write, since the Fasti ends at June 30th. Lucky for us, the festival devoted to Kybele happened on April 4th. It was called the Megalensia. It lasted for a full week and commemorated the anniversary of the Kybele stone coming to Rome. During the festival, Ovid describes the frenzied shrieking, the clashing cymbals, the pounding of the drums that we've come to know the Gallae for. But he's confused as to what's happening, so he asks Kybele to send somebody to explain it. And she does, sending a muse. What causes the impulse to self-castrate? Ovid asks. After going through an explanation of the Attis myth that we already understand, she tells him, quote, "Attis's madness became a model. Soft-skinned acolytes tossed their hair and cut their worthless organs." This explanation seems like it was enough for the ancients, and plenty of modern scholars have just accepted this at face value as well, or assumed it was some sort of insanity because, again, what sort of man would do this to themselves? But scholar K.A. Lucker doesn't quite buy it, and neither do I. Mental illness is of course real, but the concept of madness is dictated by the prejudices of the culture that we live in at the time. Institutionally, of course, we no longer consider being transgender to be a mental illness, but that's not going to stop some very smart and very interesting boy from going into the comments and calling me a mentally ill degenerate, or whatever it is that conservative photocopies are calling us these days. The fact that contemporary Roman writers figured that the Gallae were emulating Attis's insanity, and therefore were insane themselves, is not something that we as modern scholars should just uncritically accept as true. The Romans saw in the Gallae behavior that was outside of what their social norms were at the time, so they assumed they were insane. Yeah, they're part of our culture, but it's not their fault. They're just crazy, but we just lock them away and we let them do their thing and let them be crazy. It also doesn't make a whole lot of sense to just say that their behavior is a result of a religious experience. Because if it was just a way to honor Attis, there were hundreds of ways they can do that without grabbing a shard of pottery. And while there are other eunuchs throughout other cultures that do so for sexual purity reasons, we often see the Gallae referred to as prostitutes, so that doesn't really make sense either. So, why then? Will Roscoe, in his paper, Priests of the Goddess, suggests that they may have done so to escape the pressures of a male social role. You'll find transphobes today making such claims as well, especially about trans women. And look, no disrespect to Will Roscoe. If you know him, you know he's done some really, really good research when it comes to queer history. And I'm not saying he's a transphobe here, but this is such a hilariously bad take. It gives me a headache because, okay, yes, the expectations of being a man can weigh heavily on you. I used to pretend to be one, I understand. But my dude, Will, buddy, you just heard how the Romans treated the Gallae, and you've seen how society treats trans women today. How could you possibly think that that's easier? It's like a CEO who makes 7 figures a year saying his life has too much pressure, so he's gonna give it all up and become a burger flipper at Burger King. Like, yes, you are getting rid of one set of problems, but you're trading it for another set of problems that are so much heavier that it just seems absurd to think that that's actually an easier life. The ideas that cis people have about why we exist are so easy to poke holes in. It's like talking to little babies sometimes. But okay, all that said, we're really no closer to answering the question of why the Gallae existed the way they did, are we? Well, there is one possibility we've yet to explore. Is it possible that the Gallae rituals were an elaborate way to deal with gender dysphoria? Unfortunately, we have no writings that come directly from the Gallae. I wish we did. We don't. But this does seem like the most straightforward explanation. When you spend time in trans circles, eventually you're going to find girls who have so much bottom dysphoria that they express a desire to just cut it off. Fortunately, modern medical procedures are able to fix that in a way that's not quite so brutal, but I sometimes wonder what a trans woman might do if she was in such a situation without modern medicine. My bottom dysphoria isn't quite so acute. It's definitely there, and I'm definitely taking measures to do something about it, but there are still times where I find I deeply relate to the stories of the Gallae. Chapter 6. So, were they transgender? Are you serious? Are you really asking me that question? This is a ridiculous question. Of course they were transgender. Of course they were transgender. Occasionally you'll see articles showing up in places like VIII or some other general interest publication that doesn't specialize in history and definitely doesn't specialize in trans history and definitely isn't written by trans people saying that they must have been cis men that were just really devoted to Kybele. And this is such an unbelievably ridiculous idea that I can't believe anybody would print it and still have any self-respect. Look, there are limited situations where cis men like to dress and act as women on a temporary basis. This is true. That's the case with cross-dressers, who get their jollies from acting like ladies. It's also true of drag queens, who like to perform as caricatures of women. But I have a really hard time imagining a situation where a man would be perfectly fine, perfectly happy living as a woman for the rest of his life. And I'm sure a whole lot of trans men in the audience are going to back me up on that one. So I'm proceeding on the assumption that the Gallae are not men who served an unusual religious role in life, but were actually transgender women and were doing their best to change their body to be more in line with what they wanted it to be, given the world that they lived in and the technology available at the time. Maybe this is more self-evident through a transgender lens. But if there are any cis people in the audience, you're welcome to be here, by the way. If there are any cis people in the audience, I want you to take a moment to really ask yourself if you would be happy living in a gender that is the opposite end of the gender binary you're currently in. If the answer is no, then you just kind of answered your own question, didn't you? And if the answer is yes, well, maybe you're not quite as cis as you thought you were. Chapter 7. Unexpected Consequences. One of the wildest things that I discovered when I was doing research on this topic is the fact that there is legal precedent for a third gender in Western society that is at least as old as Christianity is. The evidence for this comes from the Roman writer Valerius Maximus. He was a Roman who lived in the 1st century CE during the reign of Tiberius, Augustus's successor, Emperor number 2. His work today survives as a collection of anecdotes about Roman history. In it, he describes 2 slaves, Ganucius, who was a eunuch, and Naevius Annius. Both of them were owned by a guy named Sordinus, who decided to free them both at the same time. After Naevius died, he left his property to Ganucius, but Sordinus contested this on the grounds that, being a Gallae and a eunuch, Ganucius could not inherit property. After all, Roman law laid out specific rules for inheritance that were different depending on whether you were a man or a woman, and Ganucius, being a Gallae and a eunuch, was neither. During the court proceedings, Ganucius was banned from entering the court and speaking in self-defense. After all, the presence of a Gallae would pollute the court. The court decided in favor of Sordinus, and he ended up inheriting Naevius's stuff instead of Ganucius. Messed up, right? And yeah, it is. But it does have some interesting connotations as well. Sordinus's argument hinged on the fact that Ganucius was neither a man nor a woman. And for this to be valid, the court would have to recognize that Ganucius was neither a man nor a woman. And if Ganucius is not a man and Ganucius is not a woman, Ganucius must be a 3rd gender. Now, legal recognition is not the same as legal protection. In this case, it's quite the opposite. And yes, I know most trans women would take umbrage at the idea that we're a 3rd gender, myself included. I'm not a 3rd gender, I'm a woman. I'm just a bit of a different woman than what you might be used to, but a woman nonetheless. But I still think it's kind of cool that legal recognition of genders beyond the binary is at least a couple thousand years old. Chapter 8. What does this all tell us? The mythology around Kybele is packed with gender transgression, and the worship of Kybele is also packed with gender transgression. Did the cult of Kybele arise as a way for the Gallae to express their gender nonconformity in a way that's more socially acceptable? Or is the myth older than that idea, and it became that more acceptable place after the fact? I lean more toward the former. But one of the things that's interesting to me is the idea that the Gallae had a religious reason for their experiences. As an atheist, it's easy for me to just write it off and say, well, they didn't really believe in Kybele, they just wanted to be girls, and this was the only way they were able to do it. And that might have been the case for some of them, but the ancient world was a different place. There were atheists, of course. We talked about Lucretius earlier in this video, who was probably the most famous Roman atheist, and the Emperor Vespasian was probably an atheist too. But the ancient Mediterranean in general was much more religious, much more spiritual than modern Western society tends to be. Writing off the motivations of religious people as having some sort of scheme behind them is, I think, a little too reductive. It might work when you're looking at the motivations of American megachurch preachers, you know, the ones that become multimillionaires. There's a very clear profit motive there, but what did the Gallae have to gain from a material perspective? Well, they gained an opportunity to live a life more in line with the gender they felt inside, as well as a community that supported them in exchange for a far more marginalized social role. And really, how is this any different from how modern trans people view their transitions? I mean, we often look at it from a very individualist perspective. It's about being who we are. It's about finding a sense of inner peace. It's about aligning our body with how we feel we are inside. And this makes sense in the modern world, which is far more individualistic than the past was. After all, we live in a society. The Gallae lived in a society as well, but they lived in a society that was far more religious than the modern world. So is it any wonder that the Gallae expressed their specific flavor of transness differently than modern trans people do? Because being transgender is real. The feelings you feel about your gender are real, but they're also dictated by the society in which you live. We have always existed. But the way we exist and the way we express our existence is different depending on the culture in which we live. So if you were a trans feminine person from 2000 or so years ago, you might have found comfort in the idea that there were a group of other trans feminine people who were using a religious experience to express their gender nonconformity, and their gender identity. And we know the cult of Kybele traveled quite a bit as well. In fact, we found the remains of a Gallae priest in what would have been the northern part of Roman-ruled Britain, and when St. Augustine was talking about the Gallae in the quotes that I mentioned earlier, he was talking about them in the city of Carthage in modern-day Tunisia. So it wasn't just a Rome thing. So if you were a trans-feminine person living in the far reaches of the empire, a traveling Gallae might have been a beacon of hope for you, in a way. A sign that, even if marginally speaking, trans-feminine people found a way to be accepted within Roman society. The Gallae can serve as the same for us today as well. If you're a trans person and you're living in the modern world, I don't need to tell you how scary it is out there. But perhaps you can take some comfort in knowing that we have always existed, and we're going to continue to exist, regardless of how they try to stop us. Thanks for watching, everybody. God, this video almost killed me. I was completely finished editing it, the entire thing, and then my file crashed and got corrupted, and I had to start from scratch, and it took me forever to write the damn thing in the first place, so I appreciate your patience with me. I also appreciate my backers on Patreon. You wonderful people. I am so grateful for all the support that you offer me here on this little bitty channel. If you want to support the channel, you can find a link to my Patreon in the description. It starts at just $1 a month, and it really does make a difference. But anyway, I want to say special thanks to Lise, Sawyer Lovett, Maddie Design, Zimzamzom, Juxie, Sloan, Stephanie S., Rocket Queen 88, Teabag, Woo, Lynn Riordan, Espresso Tanuki, Leet Zoe, Jane Ellen, Daphne, and Infotoxin. Thank you so much to all of you. Lord knows when the next video is going to come out. I do my best to keep up with these things, but it takes a lot of research. It's not like I can just shoot off the cuff. I've got to make sure that my stuff is really well researched. And even then, I'm pretty sure I miss certain things here and there. I do my best. I'm just a lowly undergrad after all. But the next topic I'm going to cover is going to be on the more than 10,000 year history of gender non-conforming art on the island of Cyprus. I'm really excited about this one. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and I've discovered some pretty wild stuff that I'm really excited to share with all of you. Anyway, I'll see you next time.